Thank you so very much, Andrew. Our last speakers for the day are Vanessa Brown, Lexi Gird, Courtney Cabell, and Beverly Griffor. This team will be speaking about Kink Cultural Competence Scale. Vanessa, I look forward to what your team has to share today. 4 viewers.
Three of us are speaking, so yeah. Beverly is our statistician, and so she's here to guide any questions related to statistics because Lexi, Caitlin, I don't think you're part of our research team if you want to go back on hiding yourself. And Courtney, none of us have very good statistics background, so Beverly's here to aid us with that. I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. So our research team is actually even larger, and I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to this topic. I had a student, Lexi, approach me and say, hey, I want to do some research on kink shaming, like therapists shaming people in the kink community. And I said, that sounds like a lot of fun. Let's do it. And so Lexi and I got together and were unable to find really a lot of information that we needed regarding specifically mental health practitioners and kink shaming, specifically that there was no scales, there was no measures for us to use. So our original idea here, which we've lovingly named the Cox now, is that we wanted to measure kink shaming with mental health clinicians. And when we noticed that there was this disparity, we decided to switch to actually creating the scale so that this can be used for future research and also to help therapists to sort of get a sense of what their own biases are. I told Lexi and my team, I'm always in for any kind of like fun, comedic, little bit of silly research. So I'm so glad that there are people out there doing trauma research because that's not my jam. I like doing things where we can, have some jokes and humor. So hopefully we'll entertain you a little bit over the next few minutes. So I wanted to then introduce, I'm going to turn it over to Lexi, who would be the chair of this presentation, except because of some power dynamics with students not getting sometimes opportunities to do research because of institutional review board requirements. I am listed as the chair as a faculty of Michigan School of Professional Psychology and an associate chair over at Saybrook University. But I wanted to really highlight Lexi as the lead and the creator of this idea. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lexi.
Thanks, Vanessa. Hi, everyone. My name is Lexi. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of this study and get into our skill creation before passing it off to Courtney. So although there's an increase in requiring therapists to have cultural competence, we're still rarely seeing the kink community represented in that. So many states such as California, Maryland, Michigan, and Washington are now requiring implicit bias training with scales to measure provider bias. But as Vanessa said, there's no existing cultural bias scales for the kink community. So that's what we've worked to create as a team here. So this study really aims to increase awareness of mental health best practices for serving the kink community. And it's been cool to hear some comments from peers and colleagues who have participated in our survey, saying things like they've simply learned things just by taking the survey, which is typically not the common experience. So we hope that this can also be a starting point for future research, both on our end and maybe inspire others to do the same. All right. So comfy with kink. This is the first portion of our scale. Our first thought with this study is that it's important for mental health professionals to talk about a whole variety of sexual behaviors because we know this is a huge issue within the community, lacking the space to talk openly about sex, let alone talk openly about kink. So we developed this scale item that's listed on the slide here and provided some examples for clarification on some terminology and to assess a professional's comfort in discussing a variety of sexual behaviors with their clients. And here's a lovely other meme. We have some kinky memes throughout the presentation for your enjoyment. Okay, so after our Comfy with Kink scale, the second portion of our scale is regarding our competency-specific items. So a major resource that we utilize when creating our scale was the Kink and Polyamory Aware Professionals website, which Melody mentioned in their presentation as well. They provide a directory of therapeutic, medical, and legal professionals who have stated that they're knowledgeable about and sensitive to diverse expressions of sexuality. They also provide many resources regarding sex-positive support for kink and non-monogamy, including the Kink Clinical Practice Guidelines, which are meant to deepen understanding of best practices when working with folks with kink interests. So these guidelines were created after acknowledging the lack of training and education, as well as the stigma that exists surrounding kink sexualities, in an attempt to fill that gap and address unmet needs. So the Kink Clinical Practice Guidelines Project put together 23 guidelines that outline quality and desirable professional practices and discuss the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are important for providing culturally competent care to the kink community. So what our research team did was we adopted each of these ethical standards into a survey item for our scale, which can be answered using a Likert scale indicating the degree to which a professional agrees with that statement. So for example, I've included guideline 18 here on the screen, which states clinicians understand that societal stereotypes about kink may affect the client's presentation and treatment and the process of therapy. So we adapted this guideline into a scale item that reads, societal stereotypes regarding kink may influence a client's presentation and treatment, to which the person would then, score that on a Likert scale, saying how much they agree with that statement. Okay, and next I'll talk about the auxiliary scale items. This was the third portion of our scale, where we utilized the MCAS, which is the Multicultural Counseling Knowledge and Awareness Scale, as an auxiliary scale as a portion of this survey. So the MCAS is a self-report inventory to examine a person's multicultural counseling knowledge and awareness. It's made up of 32 items, uses a 7-point Likert scale, and is broken down into 2 sections, one on awareness and another one on knowledge. And I've included an image here that has the first few items of the MCAS listed. So taking all 3 components of our survey, we've got that first section, the Comfy with Kink scale item. We've used our competency-specific items based on the Kink Aware Professionals Clinical Practice Guidelines, and then the auxiliary scale items utilized from the MCAS. We hypothesize that those who possess greater general cultural competence will also possess greater kink cultural competence. And now I will pass it over to Courtney, who will present more information on our data findings.
All right. So in our data collection process, we administered an online survey. We did have exclusion criteria, including being required to be 18 years or older and identifying as a mental health clinician to participate. Originally, 406 individuals responded to the survey, but only 276 participants were included in the sample size for data analysis after we removed participants who didn't meet inclusion criteria or who skipped more than 20% of the questions. Most of the participants who were removed were those who dropped out as soon as they encountered the Comfy with Kink scale. Slide. Okay, and so we conducted an exploratory factor analysis. An initial analysis was run and 3 factors were determined: knowledge, clinical applications, and attitudes. We removed 7 items that didn't load, and then a second analysis was run and 2 more items were removed that didn't load. Next, tertiary analysis was run, 1 item was removed for major cross-loading among the factors. And then a quaternary analysis was run. 1 item was removed for its negative loading on scales, and then an item was re-added in an attempt to increase predictive value. After eliminating items that didn't load on the 3 primary factors, we ended up with a 12 scale item, which derived our total Cox score. And so for our final results, all 3 factors showed internal consistency with Cronbach alphas greater than 0.7, which you can see here on this slide. Factor 1, knowledge, has a Cronbach's alpha of 0.87. It had 4 items: resources, kink research, kink specialization, and social change. Factor 2, clinical applications, has a Cronbach's alpha of 0.758 with 4 items: healing, exploration, relationship, and kink age. And then factor 3, attitudes, has a Cronbach's alpha of 0.711 with 5 items: psychopathology, parenting, trauma, therapy focus, and ethical. And so the McCass versus Cox, the Cox has low to moderate correlations with the McCass awareness and knowledge scales, which suggests that multicultural competence does not necessarily capture kink competence. Those who are comfy with kink also had higher scores on the Cox with a moderate correlation shown. Therefore, the Cox and McCass are separate but related constructs.
So I'm going to stop there, and we wanted to allow some time for discussion. The next phase of research, and I put this in the chat, we are going to have this scale available as an open access scale. That's always been our goal because we wanted to advocate for social change around the kink community, so that they can get improved access to mental health clinicians who are competent, culturally competent with this area. So the next phase of our research is that we have to re-administer the Kink Competence Scale in order to develop some normative data around that. So that's phase 2. Once phase 2 comes back, we will give Quad S information about how to access that scale so that it can be used nationwide. And any questions or comments, we would absolutely be open to that.
What doesn't it load mean? Like you were saying, it didn't load. This question didn't load, or that didn't load. What is?
Thank you. And that's why we have Beverly here.
Hi, that's me. I get to talk now. Thank you very much for asking a statistics question. So we used exploratory factor analysis in this process. And essentially what it means is that we have a bunch of items and a bunch of answers, and we're trying to build a construct from that represents the thing that we're studying. And when something doesn't load, essentially what it means is it doesn't fit significantly onto the thing that we're building. It's like having an extra wheel for a wheelbarrow. So it's good and it's informational. It's a nice thing to have, but it doesn't help us increase the predictive power of the instrument that we're putting together. So when it doesn't load, it means that on each of those factors, there's a predictive relatedness value. And the value is either too small or it's not there at all for that particular item. So we didn't include it because you'd just be answering the question and it wouldn't be increasing the power of the instrument.
Thank you, Beverly. And I'll give one example. There is a kink guideline about consent being foundational to the kink community. That was one that did not load very high, and we were surprised by that. That seemed like it would absolutely be relevant here. One of our theories, again, just as the hypothesis, because this is 297 people, and they each might have their own reason for answering the way they did. But our hypothesis was that because we're measuring mental health clinicians, all of them probably have some foundational understanding that consent equals good. And so you're not going to rate consent as low, meaning that that was just inherent. It doesn't predict your competence in the kink community.
I did see a follow-up come up that asks if not loading is similar to being statistically insignificant. And I would say for the purposes of an exploratory factor analysis, yes, those two terms would be related.
There was a question, which I believe you maybe have already answered, but the question was, where can we get access to the scale? And it sounds like it is in development and you will provide some links in the future.
Yes, yes. So like Courtney was saying, we had over 400 people interested in taking it. Many of them have reached out to express interest in having the scale. That was always our intent from the beginning. But for phase two, we do need about 250 to 300 more participants. So when we send out that second scale, please send it to your different networks. That's going to help us get that scale into production much quicker. That would be the way that you can help us right now. Certainly by the end of the year is what our goal is, to have that scale open access.
A little plug for Quad S that if you are an official member of the SIG, we do have a listserv that you can be part of as an official member, and it is held just to those folks. There is a question in the chat. Have you noticed any differences in competency based on provider self-identification?
I know the answer to this question. No, not at all. Actually, we did not find a correlation between providers that identified and those that didn't, although the questions that we specifically asked could be more fine-tuned to get to that question. We really saw strong correlation with people that were familiar and able to discuss the topics, though. So the Comfy with Kink measure, which goes through, that Lexi talked about, which goes through what items clinicians were careful or uncomfortable sharing, that was really the scale that was more predictive of whether people would score higher on the Cox or not.
Next question in the chat. As a therapist, how or what can I do to inform the community I'm a safe therapist for you, since these are things not typically advertised?
Lexi, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think going back to the Kink Aware Professionals directory, that could be a great way to go about this, to sign up for that so that people can know that you're on that directory and know that you're supportive and knowledgeable regarding kink and non-monogamy. I think that was a great resource. It seems like some other people in this group are aware of that resource as well. So I think that would be great as one option.
I also know we have one of the attendees here, Katie Brower. I've been to a few of her sexual training seminars, and she has taught me that it's really important to be doing sexual health assessments right at intake. And so opening up that dialogue, especially knowing now that there is a correlation between your cultural kink competence and your ability to open dialogues around a variety of topics, that it would be important to open that dialogue right away, right? As soon as someone walks into the door, you're saying, what kind of sexual behaviors are important for us to be talking about in our therapeutic work today? And that just opens it up and lets that know that this is a safe space.
And very related to what we're talking about right now, there's another question that says, I'm curious if your team could share some thoughts on the impulse of a provider say, I'm very kink comfy, but in practice, the provider doesn't have the language to actually provide that comfy kink care. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think, and I teach a lot of other cultural competence things like spirituality, and I think it's actually more important to be using your client's language around something. We can expect in therapy to be seeing people from the kink community at many different developmental stages in their sexual exploration, and so people who are in those earlier stages are not going to have advanced language. So that might be part of your therapeutic exploration, is to help them to gain what language they're comfortable with identifying with, and then people who are later in the process, allowing them to bring that in. And so whenever I have a client that comes in, regardless of any cultural differences, that's something that I'm doing behind the scenes is, okay, I'm not real familiar with a certain community. Let's take American descendants of slavery, for example. I'm not super familiar with that. And so I'm going to go and do some background research on that area so that I can develop a common language to be bringing into therapy.
Thank you so much. So we're going to do one last question from the chat, and then we will move to the official close for the 90-minute meeting. But of course, some people, myself and many others, potentially can stay longer to have a social discussion or further conversation around these. So the last question for this group: were there any demographic differences in participants who dropped out of the survey when encountering the comfy with kink questions, or were the demographics at the end of the survey so you didn't know?
That is a fascinating question. I don't think we even included those people in our data analysis, because when someone doesn't answer the 20% threshold, then they were removed from the data analysis. So they weren't ever included for us to even examine what their demographic background is. Beverly, any thoughts about that?
I would be really interested to see that, and perhaps in the future, when we do this again, maybe we structure it so we get that information, because it would be super interesting, at least to me, to know if people that are falling off because they're presumably, if they're fleeing at the questions relating to the comfy with kink scale, maybe there's a difference. If we have a demographic difference, it would be important in terms of at least education, right? We have professional clinicians that are working with people that bugged out because we asked them if they were interested and comfortable in discussing these topics with people that walked into their doors. And these people are serving in our communities, like here. So I think it would be really interesting to know, as a way to sort of target outreach for education.
I think that's also really important as a potential limitation of our survey, because that group of people that dropped off is likely the people who would have scored lower on our scale anyways. So we want to make sure that they're still represented in the data. So we talked about, as a group, maybe restructuring our survey so that comfy with kink doesn't come up and like sort of blast you in the face with this list of activities that you may not be familiar with. And so instead, maybe easing them in with the MCAS, which has some more general cultural knowledge, and then building from there.
Thank you so very much. And so Vanessa shared their contact info in that last slide. Perhaps, Vanessa, could you put that into the chat again? There were a few people commenting that maybe there might be some collaboration, or they might need your assistance in the future. And so perhaps you can reach out to Vanessa and then work with this wonderful team collaboratively. And so